My name is Caroline McGregor. For those of you, I think I know every face here, but if I don't, just to say I'm Caroline McGregor, Professor for Social Work here at the University in the School of Political Science and Sociology, and I have great pleasure in in introducing this event. Just some practical details first. In addition to a welcome to yourselves, I would like you to welcome many of our friends and colleagues who cannot be here, partly because of the bad weather we've had just last night. We've had a lot of cancellations, but also we have a lot of alumni, students, friends, colleagues who are living overseas, and we're therefore live streaming this event to all of our friends and colleagues who can't be here today. So if we just say a big welcome also to those of you who aren't here but hopefully are watching. For anyone who has links with Facebook and Twitter, the link is there if you want to send it on to any friends you know who can't make it, but who might like to look in on the afternoon. So to say, this is a very special occasion. We have a very exciting programme, and I'll lead you through the programme as we progress through the afternoon. So I want to start with no further ado, though, to welcome Professor Chris Curtin to open this event. Chris has just stood down as Head of School for Political Science and Sociology, and is currently the Vice President for Innovation and Performance in the University. And were it not for Chris Curtin, I don't think social work would exist in NUI Galway. Chris was instrumental in bringing social work here 10 years ago. I have just had the pleasure of being here as Professor for 2 years, but incidentally I was the first external examiner for the programme in 2004. And I had the pleasure of meeting Chris then and being inspired from that point until now for his commitment to social work and to bringing it to the west of Ireland. And we're here celebrating 10 years on about how successful that has been and what a great idea and what a great thing he achieved. Chris, I know I didn't tell you I was going to say that, no. And you weren't going to say it yourself, but I think on behalf of myself, of everybody here and everybody who's not here, I think we all owe Chris a great debt of gratitude and a round of applause for that achievement. And with no further ado, Chris, I'll invite Chris to formally open this event.
Thank you. Thank you, Caroline, for those kind remarks. I don't really attribute in the role of explanation for anything. I was never a great believer in the great man, or indeed the great woman theory. I think things happen from a variety of reasons, but I'll talk a bit about what actually happened. But just to begin, to reiterate Caroline's welcome to all of you who are here, to my colleagues, and to Alistair who has travelled. To those that haven't travelled, I hadn't been familiar with this term before, weather bomb. Right, I don't use Twitter or any of these things either. So I suppose if I was a Twitter user, I'd know what a weather bomb was, right? Yeah. So that's the formalities of it, right? I think it's a fantastic achievement and a great idea to bring people here together after 10 years of this particular programme. The background to it is really, I suppose, very straightforward, but in itself quite interesting, right? And perhaps reflecting the role of chance in what happens, and ultimately the things that you become involved in, which has implications for other people. My colleague, the Vice President for Research, Lokesh Joshi, who comes from a very different background than I do, from the Indian tradition, endlessly disputes with me my understanding of the role of chance, right, and says that has a completely different understanding of it, but mine is, I think, different than his as well too. So effectively, as you know, right, we're celebrating 10 years of the programme, so I guess it had to be 2004 when the first students were enrolled, right? And compared to established programmes for social work in Ireland, as Caroline, who is, I suppose, the primary person written on the history of social work in Ireland, clearly indicates, there has been an established programme at Trinity College since the early mid-1930s, 1934 I think it was, and in UCD 1936, and in UCC, Alistair, in the 60s I imagine as well, right? So this programme is very new to the whole world of social work. The history of the then department and school in which this programme is located is quite interesting, because it's historically an unusual school in that it's, if you look at it historically how it developed from 1967, it was a department of political science and sociology, and there there has been an increasing tendency to bring, in some places, political science and sociology together, but there has also been a considerable amount of tension between sociology and politics and other areas. As the then department, now school, evolved, right, there was to some degree a certain amount of hostility towards any applied type of work taking place within the school, and a very, I suppose, strong understanding that the school was orientated to what would then be considered to be the scientific study of society and politics. And the more applied fields, of which social work would be, I suppose, obviously considered one, was deemed not to be appropriate within the school. And that was a fairly strong view. It wasn't the view that I held, actually, but it was the view which pertained throughout that period. So nothing much happened, right, with regard to social work in the school. However, there was a tradition within the school of community studies and community work. And there was a tradition within the school of looking at issues around poverty and disadvantage. And the school, or then department, I use it interchangeably, I guess, was strongly associated, for example, with the first, second and third European programs to combat poverty. And I guess it had been known for its work in that particular area. So that was the kind of the school background to having social work here. And it's significant because what happened next was as follows, right? Up until 1997, as far as I can work out, social work was accredited from outside of Ireland. That, I think, is my colleagues here who are the experts in the field, and I think by and large through the UK system, right? Yeah, okay. And in 1997, the National Social Work Qualifications Board was formed, right, with Eilish Walsh as the principal officer or CEO of the organisation. And very quickly, she formed the idea that there would be a case for a fourth provider of social work education. And in 2000, she asked to see me here in Galway, and I met with her and one other person from the National Social Work Qualifications Board, and we talked at some length about the introduction of a social work programme. And two arguments as to why she thought it would be appropriate to have the programme here. One was the history of the then department in relation to community studies, community development, and that would provide an appropriate background for the development of social work. And the other was, of course, to have the availability of social work education and training outside of the Dublin and Cork, as it was at that particular time. So we entered into a series of negotiations and talks about these types of questions. As I am, of course, not a qualified social worker, I was quite handicapped in this matter, so I sought out the advice of a number of people in the field, and in particular Noreen Kearney, who I think had more or less retired from Trinity at the time, agreed to provide assistance, and together we drew up some documentation. In the end, there was a slight amount of subterfuge in the whole exercise because in the end Eilish Walsh made it clear that, of course, she never asked NUIG to put forward an application. We were actually full of enthusiasm and wanted to do this ourselves, right? That's the way that these things sometimes finish up. So we made the application and we received accreditation, and we also got permission within the university to recruit staff. There was a budget agreed for the programme. And that's effectively how it happened, right? It's, I suppose, a series of chance factors plus a series of factors from outside, right? The programme has worked incredibly well within what's now the School of Political Science and Sociology, and has, I suppose, both set out its own distinctive features, but also, I think, integrated in so much as a programme which has very special characteristics can integrate into a school which has, let's be honest about it, a lot of diversity attached to it, right? I remember at the time when the schools were being introduced first, standing in a room with about 300 people, academics from the university, arguing the case that political science and sociology was already a school, was incredibly diverse, and should be treated as such within the system, right? So the school is diverse, and I think social work has very, very specific aspects and business to get on with, and ultimately has to meet a whole series of standards, and of course ultimately to educate and train people to be highly qualified professional social workers, which it does. But I think also that within doing that, it does integrate with other aspects of the school, and I think many of the staff of the school are contributing to the social work programme. The graduates the people who have graduated from the programme, of course, have brought great credit to the programme and to the school and are exceptionally highly regarded. Right? I think it is quite an achievement to take a programme from nothing and to turn it into something that works really well. Right? I actually think it is. We don't have to get too swelled head over it, but it's pretty good old achievement, right, to be able to do it, right. The demand for the programme over the years has been exceptional. I think outside of what was called the higher diploma in education and whatever it's called these days, it's the programme with the most demand at the thought level in the university and continues to be in highly demand. So I would like to just simply say it's been a great pleasure to be involved with this from the beginning and to wish you very well in the rest of the day, right? Thank you very much, right? And we'll see you later on.
Thanks very much, Chris, for that lovely opening. And it's lovely that there are students and past students and practice teachers all in the room, and as I know also watching us from wherever they're sitting in another country or at their desk. So with no further ado, I'm going to introduce now our keynote address. And our keynote address is from Professor Alistair Christie, from Professor of Social Work at University College Cork. And I'm delighted Alistair has been able to come today. He's going to open the discussion on social justice and social work, thinking about why we have to move on from anti-discriminatory practice. And I just want to say a big thanks to Alistair for travelling here today, but also for all of the support to university. That we have 4 social work programmes in the south of Ireland and 6 if you take in the north. And we have, well, we all have to do our own business. We also have a nice tradition of trying to work well together and cooperate. And I just want to note that Alistair and his colleagues at UCC have been tremendously supportive and helpful to us, and particularly to me personally since I've moved here in the last few years. I just want to note that and thank Alistair and his colleagues for that sort of collegiality, which is very much the spirit of what we're about. So I'm going to just going to put up your slides, Alistair, and if everyone give a round of applause and welcome Alistair to Galway for the umpteenth time.
I think you should wait till I hear what I say before we give us a round of applause. That's very generous, very generous.
So, Cormac, do you want to do it? Yeah, thanks a million.
There's a clicker. Okay, does this work?
Yeah. That's okay, sorry if you want. That's forward.
Forward,
yeah, should be. No, not this one.
This one?
There you
Oh,
go.
okay, brilliant, thank you. Right, great. It's lovely to be here. Shall I talk with a microphone? I never know whether I have this trouble wandering around. So if you can't hear me, yell at me and I'll move back to the microphone. But it's lovely to be here. Thank you for those very kind words, Caroline. It's great. And it's just lovely to be here at the birthday party. Some of my colleagues at Cork, just as I was leaving, said, "Have you got the birthday cake?" And I thought, oh shit, I haven't brought a birthday cake. And I understand there is a birthday card going around in Cork, but you'll have to wait. I didn't bring it up, but it's going signed, so you'll get a birthday card at some point. But it's lovely to be invited. Keynote speaker sounds very grand. Can Caroline say, could you come up and say a few words to open the conference? So that's what I'm doing. I'm saying a few words to open the conference. And as a kind of birthday party, I suppose, what I'm going to say is in that spirit of a birthday party, maybe rather than a very kind of focused academic piece as such. But I hope I can raise some questions, and I hope we can get into a bit of a debate and discussion afterwards. And I know there's a panel, so maybe that will facilitate that as well. So, wherein Caroline said something about social justice, I thought, well, that's a very interesting topic to speak in. And one of the things I really like about Galway is the fact that you have located the notion about rights and social justice so centrally in your programme. So really, really congratulations to you because of that. And I think this combination of having all these different institutes around you must, I'm sure, rub off on how you see social work and be a stimulus in terms of thinking about issues around social justice and rights. So congratulations for that, and congratulations for that kind of linkage you seem to have, creative linkage you seem to have made here. I'm kind of, when we're in Cork, I look up enviously and see all these institutes and think, oh, that's wonderful, you have all that kind of research synergy going on. We have our own research synergy at UCC, but it's not quite in the same way. So congratulations for that. It's very nice to be invited back here. It's lovely to have that cooperation that we have, I think, between all the 4 universities now. I think it works really well. And Caroline was very good, and Declan were very good at hosting the North-South Educators Forum. So we had a lovely social work educators forum, and that's really lovely for people who teach on social work courses and researchers to come together and have a chance to talk to each other. It's surprising how difficult it is to get to places like Dublin and Galway and Belfast in such a relatively small island, but somehow we don't often talk to each other. But we're getting better, and we're getting better about using Skype these days to actually have a conversation with each other. So that's a real improvement. So just my starting point is that I think social work is a really important job, and as I put up there, I think social work is one of the most intellectually and emotionally challenging jobs in the world. And having been a social worker for a good few years earlier on, in the UK and in Canada for a while, I could see that, and I could certainly see that in terms of my visits out and seeing social workers now in the field and visiting students on placement. So I think it is a tremendously tricky job, difficult job, challenging job. I'm always impressed by the enthusiasm, and as you say, there seems to be lots of people who want to become social workers, lots of people who want to get on training courses. I think it's wonderful that happens. But I do think social work is one of the most difficult jobs there is around. And I think it looks like it's going to get more interesting. And I suppose when we're thinking about debates about social justice and rights, we're starting to enter into a different kind of world that we live in today. And it's hard to think about social justice and rights without taking on board some of that notion of context. What's actually happening in the world out there? So social work education and social work research is crucial in terms of preparing people to actually engage in that kind of process, that very important job of social work. And when I started talking, invited to CSI, I was sitting down with a group of BSW students, and I said, well, what would you want to hear? What would you talk about? And one of them said, why should we move on from anti-discriminatory practice, as a question? And I was saying, well, I think we should. Not that we should leave it necessarily behind or forget about it totally, but there are advantages to that way of thinking about social work, and it's certainly been almost hegemonic in terms of the dominant discourse around, particularly in the UK and quite a lot in Cork and probably in the other universities in Ireland as well, that, you know, with Thompson's book about anti-discriminatory practice has been used, and it's been helpful in lots of different ways, but there are limitations to it. Some of them I put down here very quickly, just this notion about what's the relationship between the personal, the cultural, structural. There doesn't seem to be a very clear notion about what power is in terms of the whole model. McLaughlin's talked about some of the notions of what was radical in the past now becoming very institutionalised, and I think anti-discriminatory practice has become quite institutionalised in lots of ways. And lastly, Wilson and Beresford talk about this idea about how social workers seem to have claimed anti-discriminatory practice or as a kind of expertise, and in some ways they think that they've actually been exploitative by doing that, by actually claiming this knowledge, which they would argue is actually probably knowledge that should be more rightfully owned by service users. So anti-discriminatory practice has been useful, and I think it continues to be useful, and it's a good tool, and I certainly know lots of practice teachers use it in terms of thinking about placements and thinking about practice with students. So I'm not going to totally say we should move on. And I had a discussion with the students about, well, what would moving on mean? Would we leave it behind, or are there useful things we could take with it? And I think there are some useful things to take with us. But I think there are lots of other debates that we need to have now if we're going to start thinking about social justice and social rights. And I suppose we need to just start thinking about the world we actually live in. And it's hard to think about social work without thinking about the kind of economic context. And at this moment I'm going to put my glasses because I can't read the screen in front of me. So it's hard to think that we are living in a world where we're in a major change in terms of the world, and there seems to be two real big kind of triggers in terms of what's happening in the world. One is this kind of notion about a bloated and liberalised financial system, largely disconnected from the serving of the economy and society. And secondly, we have that sense, but we also have the sense that the political systems are lacking authority, power and will to govern the market. Now, this may all seem a bit disconnected from social work out there, but it's the context in which we work, and it's the context we're going to work increasingly over the next few years. And there have been various responses to the crisis. The collapse has been exacerbated by these underlying causes, doing nothing to satisfy doing everything to satisfy financial markets, and largely loading the burden on the people that we work with as social workers, on the people who are least able to bear the financial difficulties. So we might want to think about our practice in that kind of broader context. So there's a big shifts going on now, and it's difficult to predict where they're going to go in the future. And our political leaders or our various states, not just in Ireland but elsewhere, seem to have kind of come up with a lack of ideas about how we should move forward. And the immediate kind of solution seems to be going back to the past, thinking about, well, how did we deal with this in the past, and is there a kind of new model that we could develop? And I think social work, again, social work in itself could be criticised for that, thinking about, well, what have we done in the past? Could we just reshape the past to actually create a new form of social work? Whereas I think we're kind of entering a stage where we probably have to think of very different sorts of social work. Hopefully social work that are steered by notions about social rights and social justice. So, and the crisis seems to have gone the wrong way in terms of, I'm sure, a lot of the values of social work, in terms of the move seems to be towards redistribution, but towards the very rich. And there's been a liberalisation that both erodes protections and enhances the power of capital. So there have been big shifts in society which go contrary to any notion about the social work values and any sense of where social work should be located. So the question is, well, where does social work locate itself in all these big changes? And politically, there's big changes. I mean, social work's usually employed part of the state, and there's been big shifts in terms of how we understand state. But the state seems to have had difficulty actually responding to these crises. It's had difficulty responding to what kind of crisis, what impact does these crises have on people? What does issues about resource poverty, how do all these kind of things fit? The state seems to be somewhat paralysed in that. And social workers are working in a context where they're trying to pursue social work values and trying to promote social justice in a context where the state seems to be kind of largely paralysed. And broadly, there seems to have been the liberal consensus of the moderate right and the moderate left. If we've had that in Ireland, we probably could argue that it's probably maybe of the moderate right rather than the moderate left and right, although the left has obviously had periods of power. But that seems to be breaking down largely. And breaking down in a number of different countries, not just Ireland, and that's leading to, I think, xenophobic and anti-liberal rights has started to grow. You can see that in some of the countries like Greece and Spain in particular. But all over the world, political systems seem to be kind of having difficulty, seem to be splintering, seem to be ineffective. So social work as employed by the state would largely expect guidance to come from the state. Guidance would come from governments. But actually social work's had some difficulties in doing that. So I think that social work has become more difficult over the last few years, and I think it will become increasingly difficult unless we have some transformation both in the economic situation and the political situation. And lastly, I'm not a environmental expert, but I think we just have to assume, and as this diagram suggests, that things are going to change over the next 10 or 20 years, and they're going to change so significantly that social work has going to have to adapt to that. So what will social justice look like for social workers in 10, 20 years? By the time you're coming up to, a lot of you are coming up into your careers are developing and you're becoming senior managers in social work, and some of you are going on to think about retirement in 30 or 40 years' time, what will social work look like? It's going to look very different. We're going to be living in a very different world. I don't know what kind of world it's going to be in, but these aren't things that you can kind of dismiss. They aren't going to go away, and I think there's accepting recognition that we're going to be living in this environmentally challenging, different kind of world. And it's going to happen quickly. One of the things I think is good about social work is that they kind of respond quickly. Social workers are good at responding quickly, being creative, thinking about things. And I think it's those skills, the skills you have as social workers in terms of being able to respond, being able to think through situations, being able to react to situations, that will be the kind of skills that we're going to need over the next 5, 10, 30 years. So, kind of response. It's hard to think, well, what kind of response is it? And I don't think I have a solution there isn't a solution about what social work should look like in terms of what would it look like if it was steered by social justice or rights, what a better form of social work would look like. And I think President Higgins is right when he says we're experiencing now an intellectual crisis that is far more serious than the economic crisis. But because it is about thinking about what's going to be happening over the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years. And it is thinking about what's going to happen to social work. We're thinking very large. I think probably one of the criticisms about social work is it tends to think in kind of quite small periods of time. We tend to think about our cases, and we think about what's going to happen to our caseload, or what's going to happen to service users, what's going to happen when they maybe move into residential care or move out of residential care. We tend to think in terms of quite small spaces of time. But 5 years goes very quickly. And 2 years and an MSW course will fly, I'm sure. And you'll be out there, and 5 years will fly very quickly. So we have to somehow think in terms of social work about trying to get those, using that intellect and our knowledge of social work to try and think about a vision that might help us navigate those 5, 10, 50 years' time. So what will social work look like in 5, 10 years? What will actually living together look like in 5, 10, 15 years' time? And how will social workers actually support this living together? And I suppose bigger notions about solidarity. That idea that I suppose solidarity may have got out of fashion because it might have been overused in a European context, but I also think it's a good expression. For me, solidarity is about some sort of responsibility to us all, but in particular some responsibility to people we don't know. It's that sense of responsibility to the stranger. So what systems will we have in place in this rapidly changing world that will allow us to maintain some sort of solidarity? And what role will the state have in promoting that kind of solidarity? What role will maybe the civil society have? What role will the private sector in terms of thinking about how we create that notion of solidarity, how we create that sense of how we want to live together, and how social workers support that? So I do revert myself, I said I should be looking ahead, but I do revert to kind of ways of understanding kind of social justice. And I suppose I revert to this idea that the Toombs seems to be two strands for me that are very useful. One is about notion about redistribution, and one which is about recognition. And I suppose there's been lots of debates by Nancy Fraser and others about the balance between these two and how we understand these two concepts. But I think it's useful to try and to divide them up and to just have a few words to say about both of them, really. We live in a new world, a changing world, and I suppose one of the things that's happened is that we now have almost consensus that inequality is a bad thing. So we have the kind of classic text from the Wilson and Pickett's text on spirit level that I'm sure that you've discussed in class and people would know about in terms of arguing clearly that relative inequality is bad for society. We even have the OCDD, not the most radical organisations, coming out just recently with a report saying that inequality hampers growth and is bad for society. We have other new writings by, for example, by Piketty, who talks about how capitalism's failing in terms of how it's the accumulation of wealth, rapid accumulation of wealth and rapid inequalities actually stifling society and creating more social problems all the time. So we seem to have an interesting consensus of writing and new writings that seem to have sprung up and challenging the whole notion about inequality. And as I say, even quite conservative organisations seem to be saying that inequality is a bad thing. And most of them would argue for some sort of wealth tax or some form of redistribution in society. So there seems to be a consensus there. So one thing about what's happening in terms of the globe, in terms of growing inequality, seems to have responded, at least by academics and authors, writing and making very clear arguments that inequality is a bad thing. So as yet the politicians seem to not have quite understood that, and they seem to have difficulty understanding that kind of concept, but it seems to be creating a momentum. And I think it's creating a momentum that social workers can draw on. So these new kind of writings, these new kind of theories are the kind of theories that social workers can use when arguing for maybe local redistribution. So when arguing for actually services need to be developed, that service users need resources, it's kind of using this material in terms of these global changes that are actually having an effect on the way that social workers work on a day-to-day basis. And I put in Daniel Dorling's work there just to say that, you know, he's written about some of the reasons why we seem to accept inequality, why this seems to continue. And I think you can, if you listen to politicians this day, you can see them using these ideas about elitism being efficient, about exclusion being necessary, about prejudice being natural, about greed being good, and despair is inevitable. And I probably expect politicians to talk about that. What I get sometimes disheartened about is when I sometimes hear it from social work colleagues and social work students. And I suppose we have to look at ourselves in terms of, are those some of the values that make us very complacent about inequality in society and make us not react as a profession to actually try and challenge some of these things. Recognition, the other side of that. Something about, rather than about material redistribution, it's about this idea about equality on the basis of being recognised, being valued, and the issue about the pain of not being recognised or being misrecognised in terms of society. And I think Beverly Skeggs, I really like Beverly Skeggs' work, and she's written with Loveday a really nice article in 2012 where they did research with working class groups in England, in the north of England and in London as well. And what came out of the research was this idea about how these groups felt undermined constantly questioned. Within a British society, they were always seen as in deprecating terms, in terms of being scroungers or unworthy. And the amount of effort that the people who were involved in research, working class groups, had to constantly fight and challenge the way they were being constructed in society. So the work is very interesting, and I think it would be a good read for anybody in training to be a social worker. It's a very interesting read, and the research methodology is interesting as well. But I suppose it's that sense of the people that we're working with as social workers largely come from this group. And I think it's sometimes hard for social workers to understand how service users can feel just worn down by that constant barrage of being dismissed, of being misrecognised, being undervalued. And I suppose it's perhaps not surprising in some ways that service users find social workers, when they are supportive, can feel that they're being judged again, being rejudged again. So it's that notion about how recognition is important and how misrecognition can be very undermining and can cause great pain to people. And Skeggs, Loveday, and I like their work, and they draw on the work of Bourdieu very nicely, I think. And I know obviously Paul's written about work around Bourdieu as well. I think it's very, very useful kind of theory in terms of developing social work practice. Just briefly about my own research. I've done some work around race and racialization and notions about whiteness. I know Paul's written about this as well. I've done a couple of pieces of work. One, I'm trying to look at how this kind of notion about whiteness, how dominant racialized values get embedded within social policy. And very quickly, if you want to look at some of the child protection guidelines, you can see how the way that both black and minority ethnic groups, the way that they're described and where they're positioned in terms of the Children First guidelines, and in particular the little handbook that goes along with the children protection, and how when they are described, they're described in terms of very negatively, in terms of issues about genital mutilation, around other topics as well. So they're described in very negative terms. So there's no sense of a recognition or a valuing of diversity at all. The second bit of work that's ongoing is just actually talking to foster parents, white foster parents who are fostering, or foster carers, who are fostering black and minority ethnic children. And that's been interesting, talking to these Irish white people about their experience of having black children in the house, not so much about what their services they provide or how they care for the black children, although that's very interesting as well, but just how that has shaped their own sense of identity as being white and what questions that has raised for them. And for them, probably the first time, they've told me the first time of walking down the street with a black foster child and realising that racism exists in Ireland and how that affects people. So a little bit about, just a little flavour of what I'm trying to do in terms of my research, trying to explore that notion about race, racialised groups and whiteness in terms of social work. So, finishing up, perhaps some suggestions, very tentative suggestions for perhaps a more socially just social work. Again, talking to social work colleagues the other day, we were having a discussion about what would it be useful to move from a debates about service to more to support. And they were saying they were really fed up about social workers talking about services, about professionals, and what they wanted to shift from was talking about what they provided to thinking about what people needed in terms of support. So having a closer relationship with service users in terms of thinking about what was needed rather than what they could provide. I think they felt that what happened in the discussions within social services was that we thought about, well, what can we provide? Rather than actually thinking about shifting to a concept of support and thinking about, well, let's actually think about support rather before we think about what we might provide in terms of services. Secondly, I suppose a bit of my local hobby horse, because I suppose my background is in community social work, and I think there's a need to return to community-based social work. I think there's a need for social workers to get closer to service users. Maybe it doesn't have to be geographically closer, although I think those ideas about community-based social work I think are still very relevant. But maybe closer just in terms of having more time, spending more time with service users, trying to understand what their position is. So I know, in cities you can do that in terms of geographical space, maybe that's more difficult in terms of rural communities. But that sense of actually getting closer to people. I think there isn't any going away from the need for just keep on pursuing our notion about democracy within social work. Keep on pursuing, trying to keep that agenda going about how we make decisions as a profession, how we make decisions in terms of with other professions, but how increasingly we make decisions along with service use. Keeping that notion about deliberative democracy as a kind of core element of social work. I suppose my politics as well would suggest that we need to think about what happens to social workers in the workplace as well as what we do in terms of working with service users. And I think we need to have social work as a profession needs to reflect the values as much as in terms of providing services going out there. So I think actually moving towards greater worker control, although that might seem like a utopian idea, I think some of these utopian ideas are good to explore in terms of, well, what are the possibilities of that? And maybe with the fragmentation of state, maybe we have to think about social work being organised in a slightly different way. If we're not going to totally see social work succumb to the private organisations, then maybe social work needs to think about, well, are there different ways that we could organise ourselves? If there's a way that we could organise ourselves outside the state or within the state, well, there are different ways of just organising ourselves. So, lastly, I think it is this idea, going back to this idea about solidarity, but how does social work maintain this notion of solidarity, the social values, this notion about caring for people we know, but caring for the stranger without any qualms about the fact that we should care for strangers, people we might not ever meet. And how do we do that? And how do we do this in this changing world? As I say, I haven't got any solutions, but I think we need to start thinking about that it is going to happen, that things will be different in 10 or 20 years' time. And I guess I'm looking around the room at relatively a lot of young faces here, probably on the master's course or just out the course, and it probably is the challenge that you're going to have to face throughout your career, that there are going to be so many changes in terms of economically, politically, and environmentally over the next few years. And I don't actually see an awful lot of writers in social work actually helping you in terms of that, in terms of thinking that long term ahead. So it's a challenge, and I don't think there's not a lot of guidance about how you achieve that. But I wish you well, and I hope that there's spaces like this where we can kind of create those debates about thinking about where do we really want social work to go, where do we think social work will go. And that's going to end.
Thanks very much, Alistair. that I think just those final points are an excellent way of ending and putting it up to students and ourselves, I guess, and all of us involved in social work to keep thinking more broadly about these issues. If it's okay, Alistair, we are going to keep it to the panel for some comments and discussions.